File connection in Fndlang is used to create connections that you can later on connect to and then modify anything from that connection. You can create a connection from anywhere you want, basically. So it could be in a function scope, in a regular scope, name scope, basically everywhere, anywhere you want, you can create a connection from there. And the way you would create a connection is by using this line of code here that you see, one line of code. So it's calling the scope key, using the arrow key, and accessing the sub key called new. This new key is a function that you have to call it with parentheses, and within those parentheses you get two argument that you have to put. The first one is required, the second one is not required. So the first one is going to be the name of the connection that you want to create. So it could be anything. It has to be a string though, basically. So it has to be in string format. So that's why we have quotation marks here. And then the name could be anything you want. And then the second parameter, or the second argument, is the value, is basically the callback. But by default, you don't have to give it a callback. It just uses the value true, which tells the connection that was created to always allow any file to basically connect to it. So if you say this to anything that is not true, like false, for example, that would make the connection, that would not allow any file to connect to this connection. Even its own, basically, it cannot connect to it because the value was set to false. So basically, setting this to false is almost like deleting that connection because nothing will be able to connect to it. So that's why the default value is always set to true, basically. But you could change that to anything you want. And that could be a function callback. So if you give it a function callback, it's gonna give you an argument value whenever a new connection is trying to connect. It's going to give it an argument value, and that value is going to represent the file that is trying to connect, or the scope that is trying to connect to this connection. So you would be able to like read what file is trying to connect to this connection that you created, and then you could later on decide to either allow it or not allow that connection. And you could do that by returning the value true or false. So if you return true, that would tell the connection, that would allow the connection to connect. And then if you return false, that would not allow the connection to work. So if you want to work with callbacks, you have to give it a function, and then within that function you could create a parameter. That parameter is going to hold the value of where the connection is coming from, and then you could read it. You could basically, see and decide from there. And then the next thing we have here is called the connect function. So the connect function, you can use it to basically make that connection to the connection that you created, the file connection that you created, basically. And in this case, you have to use the same keyword, the same arrow symbol, and then the function called link. This function takes two arguments. The first one is the file, the connection name. So this is required. The second one is not required. So the first one has to be the connection that you basically are trying to connect to. In this case, it's trying to connect to my connection name, which is the connection that I created basically up here. And then the second parameter is a timeout value. So a timeout value is needed. It's basically always recommended to make sure you have a timeout value, because by default the connection link function is actually synchronized with everything that's currently happening. So this means if there's an operation running somewhere else, that operation could be paused because of this link function. If you don't have a timeout function, this will cause the whole file code to be halt until the connection is made. But if you have a timeout value, that would make it so when the connection is not connected, and once it reaches the maximum timeout value that you give it, in this case is 1 second, it's going to stop the connection from connecting, because there's no it couldn't find the connection, and then it's going to move on to the next stuff. But if you don't have this, by default the value is set to none, so you don't have to put this this is an optional parameter, an argument, so you don't have to really have it there. By default it's going to set it to none, therefore meaning that if the connection does not exist, the code below will not execute, because it will wait until it finds the connection. And if it finds the connection, it's going to move on. But if it doesn't find it, it's going to wait until it finds the connection, because the default value is set to 1. So that's why I'm setting this to time : 1 second. So yeah. And the next one here we have is called disk, which is, you could use this function to basically disconnect from that connection that you made, which is made from using the function called link. So if you use the function link, which is connecting to a connection, you can use the function disk to disconnect from the connection. So as you can see right here, this is also a function that you have to call, and then it only expects one required argument, which is the name of that connection that you're trying to disconnect from. So if it finds that connection, it's going to disconnect you, and if it doesn't find it, it's just not going to do anything. It's going to move on to the next line. So yeah, that's the disconnection function. The last one here we have is called delete. So you can delete a connection that you created using the keyword new, basically. Using this keyword new creates this connection for us, and if we want to delete it, we can delete it by using the keyword scope arrow del, which is short for delete. And then within that, you put the name of the connection that you created, and it's going to go ahead and delete it. Now, this is not always going to work. This delete function is not always going to work. That's because the only way you're allowed to delete a connection is when you are calling that delete function in the same scope where the connection was created. So for example, if I was to do something like this, right, f just like that, this is a function that I'm creating, and then I'm going to call this function on the bottom here, which is going to call the delete function. But if I run this code, this delete function is not going to, it's going to fail basically. That's because the function that I'm calling it's creating its own scope. Therefore, the delete function that it's now looking for is not in the same scope of where the connection was created. So the delete function is looking for the connection called connection name. It's looking for that inside of the function scope. So it's not going to find it because it's not in the same, it wasn't created in the same scope. So the only way you'll be able to delete a connection is when you're calling that delete function from the same scope where the connection was created. And this is only here to prevent other malicious code executions, that could like break the functionality of the code that you wrote. That's the only reason why this does not work like that, because sometimes they could be other bad programmers or evil programmers that would try to do this kind of thing. So that's why this is not allowed. You're only allowed to use the delete function in the same scope of where the connection was created. So if you include a file and that file tries to delete this connection, it will not be able to do that because it's not in the same scope. But if it tries to connect to it using the link function, it will be able to connect to it. But you could also combat that by creating a callback function, and then checking what kind of file is trying to connect to your connection that you created, and then you can prevent that from happening by returning the false output result basically. So yeah. And then the disk function, you can execute this anywhere you want basically. It's not limited. It's the only delete function is the one that's limited, and from where you can call it from. And the new function, the link function, all these three functions are not limited. they are, you can call them from anywhere you want. It's just the delete function that is going to be, you know, the only one that you cannot call it from anywhere. You can only call this function if the the connection that you're trying to delete is created in the same scope. You know, that's really all with this documentation. I'm sure I didn't miss anything. Hopefully, I didn't miss anything else. Let me think. Yeah, I think that's really all. So yeah, thanks for watching this documentation. I'll see you guys in the next one. All right.